Good evening, everyone. I'm Bobby Donaldson on behalf of the University of South Carolina Center for Civil Rights History, the Office of the Provost, the College of Arts and Sciences, University Libraries. I wish to welcome you tonight. We're especially delighted to have Dr. William Darity Jr. and Kirsten Mullen with us, and we're especially pleased that so many of you have assembled this evening for what I know to be a very engaging and enlightening conversation. When our center began in November 2015, with the papers of Congressman James E. Clyburn, we knew that our charge was to document the important and valuable history of the civil rights movement in South Carolina and beyond. But we also understood that our charge was to connect this important civil rights history with contemporary events and struggles. And as we thought about scholars who can help us connect the history with contemporary struggles, we thought about Professor Sandy Darity. He has been here before. In September 2009, we were fortunate to have him here for the formal opening of the Institute for African American Research, led by Dr. Daniel Littlefield. As we thought about having him back, I spoke to a colleague of his, Professor Daniela Cook. We were having lunch one afternoon. She said, "Oh, I know him." She texted and asked would he be interested in coming back, and he said he would be delighted. So we're very pleased to have him with us tonight for a lecture entitled The Arc of Justice, Reparations for African Americans. Tonight is made possible by the collaboration of the College of Education, led by Dean John Peterson, the College of Education's Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, led by Dr. Michelle Bryan, the African American Studies Program, led by Dr. Belinda Littlefield, and the Ida Quincy Newman Institute for Peace and Social Justice, led by Dr. Ron Pittner. We also are very pleased to have the collaboration of the Center for Education, Equity of African American Students. 2 weeks ago, they held a read-in on the work of Professor Sandy Darity. That read-in, that discussion, was led by Dr. Daniela Cook, a professor in the College of Education. She has been an integral colleague in helping to build the Center for Civil Rights History, and I'm very pleased to introduce her to make the introduction of our keynote speakers. Dr. Cook.
Good evening. I always hate following Dr. Donaldson. He's a very great speaker. So first, I'd like to thank everyone for coming out tonight. I have the pleasure of introducing two people who are really near and dear to my heart and my intellect. Kirsten Mullen is a folklorist and the founder of Art Factual, an arts consulting practice in Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freelon Age Bond Concept Development Team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. As a faculty member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she trains students to research and document the state's African American music heritage. Kirsten was a consultant on the North Carolina Museum of History's North Carolina Legends and Civil Rights Exhibition projects. Her essays have been published in museum catalogs and journals, and in a host of commercial media. Her article, Black Culture and History Matter, in the American Prospect examines the politics of funding Black cultural institutions using the National Black Museum as a pivot. Dr. William A. Sandy Darity Jr. is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African American and African Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center of Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as chairman of the Department of African and African American Studies and was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke University. While at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Sandy served as co-director of the Institute of African American Research, director of the Moore Undergraduate Research Apprenticeship Program, and as director of the Undergraduate Honors Program and director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Economics. His research focuses on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling and the racial achievement gap, North-South theories of trade and development, skin shade and labor market economics, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade and the Industrial Revolution, the history of economics, and the social psychological effects of exposure to unemployment. He has published or edited 12 books and published more than 225 articles in professional journals. Clearly trying to say all their professional accomplishments would keep me here all night and keep you from them, which is what we really want to get to. And so I want to just close with how I understand their collective body of work, right? Folklorist Joy Salvers noted, quote, "What exemplifies Kirsten Mullen's body of work is not what she has done, but how she engages in folklore practice. As I interviewed people, they confirmed that the qualities of translating, connecting diverse groups of knowledge and people, and placing folk life within a context of cultural capital and self-determination characterizes how she does folklore." Economist Derek Hamilton stated about Sandy, quote, "From early on, Sandy would say things like brother to refer to our relationship. He really tried to break down that hierarchy of teacher and pupil. It was not competitive. It was collaborative. At some point, there were epiphanies where I realized I was making substantial contributions to the relationship." So what I've learned from Sandy and Kirsten in all these years is very simple. Be it ethnographic or economic work, you must embody humility rather than hubris. You must be willing to partner with your partner and to put the needs of the community first and realize that everyone has a voice in our conversation. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce Kirsten Mullen and Sandy Darity to tell us about the Arc of Justice.
Technologically challenged, so we'll have to make adjustments when I get here. Good evening, good evening. Thank you. You're welcome. Ah, wonderful, thank you. Don't pay attention to the woman behind the screen. All right. Okay. All right. All right. Very good. So I want to begin first by thanking Professors Donaldson and Cook for this invitation. It is a delight to be here. We were treated today to a fabulous luncheon with far-ranging conversations, and then a tour. Dr. Donaldson conducted the Columbia 63, which is an amazing moment for us to to bear witness to the incredible history of Black struggle for civil rights here in Columbia, and also to see how how much of it has, the physical aspects of it have been erased from the physical place of the city. I mean, it was just, Central Casting could not have done a better job of erasing these landmarks. And you may say, well, the buildings don't matter and progress is really important, but the truth is our memories are connected to place. And when the landmarks are gone, it's really difficult to hold on to those memories. I know for myself, I may be just traveling the same corridors every day, and then one day a building is gone, and literally a day or two later, I can't remember what was there before. And I know I'm not unusual in that regard. So it's very important to hold on to these physical spaces and to share the stories widely. So this is H.R. 40, which some of you may recognize as a bill that was introduced by John Conyers to not to make reparations happen, but to create a commission to study reparations and to think about what should be done in this country about them. All right. So in the 6 years or so that my partner, William Darity, and I have been sharing this research that we're conducting to make the case for reparations, audiences' responses have changed markedly. Okay? Many opponents of reparations focus their attacks almost exclusively on slavery, citing its long-ago past as a primary reason to dismiss any contemporary claims to redress. I will speak to this notion of slavery's long ago past a bit later. But opponents of reparations tend to ignore or downplay the history of Jim Crow and ongoing racism come discrimination. This is an extremely important topic, but it will not be the subject of my comments this evening. Today I will address some of the ways that white Americans have benefited from unmerited privileges that flow from slavery. You all know the story of the self-made man, self-made woman. You always wonder what that person's parents would say if they were given the opportunity to discuss it. So, in their exceptional publication, Complicity, How the North Promoted, Prolonged, and Profited from Slavery, Anne Farrell, Joel Lang, and Jennifer Frank trace the trade beginning in 1641, when the Massachusetts Bay Colony legally recognized the institution of slavery. Virginia was already a slave trading site at this time, but Massachusetts was the first to legally sanction servitude. This is a copy of Massachusetts Charter, and we have here Article 91. There shall never be any bond, slavery, vintage, or captivity among us unless it be lawful captives taken in just wars, and such strangers as willingly sell themselves or are sold to us. It's like, when did that happen? All right. And these shall have all the liberties and Christian usages which the law of God established in Israel concerning such persons doth morally require. This exempts none from servitude who shall be judged thereto by authority. So this passage actually seems to suggest that if these captive Africans who willingly, agreed to be captives, if they also agreed to be Christians, then they could possibly find the route to freedom. But later, they passed legislation saying that anyone from the continent could not be a Christian, right? The rules kept changing, right? Whatever you thought the rules were, it's a moving target, all right? So, supplying provisions for these slaves and for the vast plantations in the Caribbean and in South America required the efforts of a staggering number of financiers, merchants, lawyers, insurers, shippers, real estate brokers, auctioneers, and laborers. One example of a new market driven by the slave trade was the colonial shipbuilding industry. An international network of shipwrights, sailmakers, barrel makers, lumberjacks, carvers, engravers, machinists, blacksmiths, silversmiths, ironsmiths, iron workers, tool makers, mechanics, gunsmiths, and ammunitions manufacturers kept the ocean-going sailing ships and the crews that transported captured Africans to the booming markets in the Americas afloat. The Navigation Act, which defined British international trade restrictions, essentially limiting colonial trade to England, were enacted as early as 1651 and gave American ships the same protection as British vessels, thereby reducing financial risk to the ship's owners and increasing profits. While there were some who warned against the evils of slavery, the profits the institution promised those who invested in its promulgation were often too great to ignore. From the docks of Providence, Rhode Island, and Boston and Salem, Massachusetts, a round robin of outgoing ships carrying dairy products, fish, and rum followed vessels unloading slaves, sugar, and molasses. The export of goods, especially exports to the West Indies and to plantations in the American South, made possible the dramatic expansion of commerce in New England, the purchase of luxury goods from Europe, financial security, and a lifetime of leisure unavailable up to this time. And because all commercial roads led to the slave trade, one need not actually have owned slaves to profit from the black bodies trade. Newspapers like the Hartford, Connecticut Courant, which dates from 1764 and is still being published, profited from the sale of advertisements supporting the sale and capture of slaves. Adverts for slave ship crews, the provisioning of slave ships and plantations, and the sale of slave-made goods. Aetna is one of a host of insurance companies that provided coverage for slave ships and their cargoes. At least 5,000 slaves were insured in Connecticut in 1790, and, according to Lang, the majority of the state's formidable institutions enslaved at least one African. Indeed, there were plantations throughout Connecticut, and while they were generally referred to as farms, the scale of these enterprises and the numbers of their slave personnel would have marked them as plantations had they been located in the American South, the Caribbean, or South America. Slave-grown cotton was the national currency that seeded the growth of American cities before the Civil War. Between 1821 and 1860, New York City, a major importer of cotton, became the nation's and the world's largest commercial and financial center with the aid of this good. Failed investment bank Lehman Brothers began as a cotton brokerage in Montgomery, Alabama in 1850 and would become the state of Alabama's fiscal agent. The company's founder, Henry Lehman, immigrated from Reparations, Germany to Montgomery in 1844 and set up a modest shop selling groceries, dry goods, and utensils to area cotton farmers. Buoyed by strong sales, he was joined by his brothers Emanuel and Meyer in 1850, and together they went into the commodities brokerage business, constructed a cotton storage warehouse, and became the area's largest buyers and sellers of cotton, phasing out their general merchandising enterprise. Like all Southern businesses, Lehman Brothers struggled financially during the Civil War period, and as Reconstruction unfolded, family members focused on relocating their operations to New York City. Cotton continued to trump all domestic trades, however, and in 1870, the Lehman Brothers spearheaded the formation of the New York Cotton Exchange, the first commodities futures trading venture. Meyer Lehman was appointed to its first board of directors. Real estate and shipping tycoon John Jacob Astor made his fortune in furs, the Chinese opium trade, and transporting cotton to the world's ports. Jeweler Charles Louis Tiffany opened the iconic flagship shop Tiffany's on New York City's Broadway streets in 1837 with capital from his father, Comfort Tiffany, whose fortune had been derived from the operation of cotton manufacturing company in what would become Danielsonville, Connecticut. New York City was booming in the late 1830s, largely as a consequence of the cotton trade. Archibald Gracie Jr., the son of Scottish international shipper Archibald Gracie of Gracie Mansion fame, left New York City to become a cotton broker in Mobile, Alabama. The cotton-producing states were integrally connected to the fortunes of New Yorkers. Historian Bernard Balin affirms that feeding and clothing the millions of slaves working the sugar plantations throughout the Americas was big business, and the income from these enterprises enriched New England and the mid-Atlantic. Slave-grown cotton made the expansion of the area's textile mills possible, some 472 institutions in 1860. One Connecticut town, Thompson, was home to 7 mills. During the decades 1830 to 1840, New England mills processed in excess of 100 million pounds of cotton grown in the South. By 1860, 10 major cotton-producing states in the South, home to 2.3 million enslaved Africans living on 75,000 cotton plantations, produced 66% of the world's cotton and raw cotton, which accounted for more than half of all U.S. exports. Great Britain, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Germany, Russia, Italy, Spain, and Belgium all were dependent upon U.S. slave-grown cotton. At least 2 Connecticut towns were built on the global production and milling of Africa-based ivory, clearly an industry that would not have existed without the slave trade. Katrina Brown's film, Traces of the Trade, and her cousin Thomas Norman DeWolf's book on the DeWolf family story, Inheriting the Trade, a northern family confronts its legacy as the largest slave trading dynasty in the U.S. history, look at their ancestors' extensive role in the lucrative slave trade market. hiring captains and crews throughout New England. They participated in some 1,000 plus voyages to Africa that brought over 100,000 captives to the Americas. We met Katrina Brown, actually, and her cousin, and she shared an interesting story about her childhood. Katrina grew up in Bristol, Rhode Island, and she had fond memories of the celebration of Independence Day, July 4th. And apparently Bristol really did it up. They had a parade, they had speeches, the Declaration of Independence was read aloud throughout, they had all kinds of reading groups and children participated. But there would always be a dais with bunting and flags. And, every year her family members would be the people who were privileged to sit on this dais. I mean, it was almost like the town was performing for them. People would tousle her hair and, tweak her cheek and just, say really wonderful things to her about her parents, her grandparents, her great-parents. But she always wondered, why are we up here? The whole town is here. Why are we the ones, year after year after year, who are given this, this august seat of respect and, and honor? What is this about? And she was asking different family members, and people were, I don't know, we're respectful, we're good citizens, we're boosters for our town. We've hired a lot of people, and people depend on us. We're good souls. Yes, we're part of this community, but we've also been the drivers of the community. But eventually, she encountered a relative who said to her, well, we were in the slave trade business. We actually imported more slaves than any other family in the U.S. And she said, in that exact moment that she heard those words, it was like she already knew. She knew it couldn't be for something that she imagined to be celebratory. She already knew somehow that the reason why they were vaunted, the reason why they were held in such high esteem, is because they had enslaved black people and helped make this country what it was. And she was not proud to know that. If you've not seen the documentary, it's fascinating. She gathered maybe 7 or 8 of her cousins, many of whom she didn't even really know that well, and they basically traced the triangle trade and met people along the way and filmed. And you see them, having their, come to Jesus moments. It's quite a revealing project. One of the things we learned too is that well, let me go back and say, throughout New England, shipyards emerged to build these vessels that would become the ocean-going prisons for African slaves, equipped with iron chains and shackles and water tanks. When the slave trade was legally abolished in this country in 1808, buying and selling black people simply went underground. The reason why Thomas Jefferson appears here is that the Wolfe family, not surprisingly, were on first-name basis with Thomas Jefferson. And so when the slave trade became illegal, they contacted him and said, would it be okay if we kept importing slaves? And he said, wink, wink, sure. All right. Thank you, Thomas Jefferson. The privileges and pampering and the pampered life that participants could obtain from the centuries-long practice were too enticing and familiar for many to resist. Indeed, the Complicity authors report a conservative estimate is that during the illegal trade's peak years, 1859 and 1860, at least 2 slave ships, each built to hold between 600 and 1,000 slaves, left lower Manhattan every month. Every month. Baby needs new shoes. All right. We and others, including Lorenzo Johnston Green, whose The Negro in Colonial New England, 1620 to 1776, is a vital resource, contend that slavery was not contained in the American South, and the economy's effects of slavery were far from limited to the South. Historian Ronald Bailey extends Green's discussion in his article, The Slave Trade and the Development of Capitalism in the United States, the Textile Industry in New England. It is time to accept our nation's tortured past for what it was, an immoral and cruel reality. The destruction of African families and clans was a key element in the wealth equation for America. African lives are the foundation upon which this nation was built. As African families were being torn apart, fortunes derived from the slave trade facilitated the growth of white families through unprecedented rates of natural reproduction. With incomes on the rise and cash and credit readily available, Americans were finding it possible to marry at younger ages and begin to expand their families. I would like to rebut briefly the often lodged charge that slavery was so long ago, there is no reason to bring it up. From a generational perspective, American slavery was not that long ago. Ended in 1865, now 153 years ago. If a new generation comes into existence every 30 years, the youngest generation is the fifth generation since the end of slavery, on average. But in some families, the generational distance is much narrower. Okay? In my mother's family, I, Kirsten Mullen, am a member of the fourth generation since slavery, following my mother, Ava San Mullen, her mother, Harriet Tolliver Mitchell, who died 5 years ago, and Harriet's father, Walker Tolliver, who was born in slavery. My great-grandfather was a slave. All right. From my earliest childhood memories, I heard stories about Walker, a minister who was born in Caroline County, Virginia, and his wife, Hattie. Portraits of the couple hang in my mother's house. On my father's side, there is my father, James Otis Mullen, his father, Otis Mullen, Otis's father, Delu Mullen, and Delu's mother, Sally, who was enslaved by her common-law husband, with whom she had 7 children. Otis Mullen said, when presented with our son Aiden, his great-grandchild, not long after our child's birth, it was one of those Kunta Kinte moments. He said, "He is the 5th generation." I had no idea what he was talking about. But we learned. Kenneth Lewis, candidate for U.S. Senate from North Carolina in 2008, is the great-grandson of a slave. The Black Caldwell family, with connections to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, is another family with a grandfather who was born into slavery. The maternal great-grandparents of my partner, William Darity Jr., were born enslaved. I've not begun to speak of the effects of slavery to the present or the myriad consequences of not providing 40 acres and a mule to the ex-slaves, but clearly there have been many long-lasting effects of the slave trade on the fortunes of white Americans. Thank you.
So first, I'd like to say my thanks also to the righteous scholars who have invited us to participate at this event. Bobby Donaldson, Daniela Cook, Michelle Bryant, who I have a long history with. And I also noticed that the Swinton family is in this president, David Swinton. Yes. The president emeritus of Benedict College, who is also a very, very old friend. So very grateful to see you all here. I'd like to start with the concept that is the name that we've assigned to this conversation, which is the acronym ARC. The acronym ARC, for our purposes, represents 3 things: acknowledgement, redress, and closure. So by acknowledgement, we simply mean the admission or recognition on the part of the perpetrators of a grievous injustice or the beneficiaries of that grievous injustice that something horrible has occurred and that they have an obligation to address the consequences of that horror. Second is redress, which is the actual form that the compensatory action will take that's undertaken on behalf of those who have suffered from the horrible injustice. And then closure is the notion that the compensatory action is of sufficient magnitude that it creates a circumstance where the victimized community no longer will make further claims for changes that might be conducted at the national level. Now, let me say this. Of course, if a new injustice takes place, then there's a foundation for a new claim. Okay. I also want to indicate that the case for reparations that we have been making, and I think Kirsten emphasized this, even though she focused on the first of the three prongs, the case for reparations that we've been making has been contingent upon a case that's based on slavery, but also Jim Crow and ongoing racism and discrimination. And I would argue or submit that perhaps the strongest case for reparations must be anchored in the period of Jim Crow in terms of its long-term repercussions and the failure to make a change that's transformative in American society that would have provided Black Americans with the opportunity to fully participate in this country. So I mentioned also the third prong, which is ongoing racism and discrimination, and I think that that's fully indexed by the magnitude of disparities in wealth in the United States. So I want to emphasize wealth rather than income. And here's what I mean. Wealth constitutes the difference between what you own and what you owe. It is the value of your assets minus your debts, the net worth of your possessions. And in fact, the magnitude of these disparities in wealth is enormous. And I'll come to that in a moment. But before I do that, I want to emphasize why I think wealth is more significant than income. Okay? So the first reason is having a significant amount of wealth or net worth provides you with protection against interruptions in income. So, for example, an individual or a household might be confronted with emergency expenses because somebody lost their job. Or they might be confronted with emergency expenses because of a catastrophic illness. Now, of course, you can curb the burden that you bear from catastrophic illnesses if you have adequate medical insurance. But of course, wealthier individuals are more capable of purchasing higher quality medical insurance, particularly in a country that does not provide medical insurance for everyone. Secondly, individuals with higher levels of wealth can purchase high quality primary or secondary schooling for their children. And they can do this in one or two ways. They can purchase their way into high cachet neighborhoods where there's supposed to be quality public schools, or they can purchase high-quality education directly by having their kids attend a private school. Third, individuals with higher levels of wealth can make it possible for their children to obtain higher education without accumulating large debt burdens. Fourth, in fact, you can pay for many things without accumulating debt if you have a significant amount of wealth. Fifth, wealthier families can provide substantial bequests and gifts for the next generation, thereby maintaining and preserving wealth in the family. So when Kirsten was talking about the historical relationship between the economic development of New England and the entire United States and slavery and the slave trade, the kinds of consequences of that developmental process are still embedded in the lives of many, many living Americans who are white as a consequence of the kinds of benefits that were transferred to them across generations. So if we think about the DeWolf family, for example, who Kirsten mentioned, the current generations of DeWolfs are extraordinarily wealthy. and they're extraordinarily wealthy because of the slave trade. Okay. Now, what about the magnitude of these gaps? Well, the scope of the difference in wealth by race in the United States far exceeds the scope of the difference in income. So if we look at the median black household and the median white household, using data from the Survey of Consumer Finances, the average black household has 1/10 of the net worth of the average white household. So this is somewhere in the vicinity of comparing a net worth that's approximately $10,000 with a net worth that's approximately $100,000. Okay. If you were to use the Survey of Income and Program Participation, the 2014 data would suggest that the disparity is even wider, that it's $1 per $13 in net worth for black versus white households. The difference between the two surveys, the Survey of Consumer Finances oversamples people who are more affluent, and the Survey of Income and Program Participation oversamples people at the lower end of the income distribution. And there's one final statistic I'd like to share with you about these disparities. Black Americans constitute approximately 12 to 13% of the U.S. population, but black Americans own about 2% of the nation's total wealth. So now we come to the question of why we have these disparities, and this is what's really relevant to the conversation about reparations. Because there's one frame of thinking about this which is used frequently by opponents of reparations to argue that there's no justification for the provision of this type of redress for black Americans. And that perspective is one that says the reason we have these huge disparities in wealth is because of black behavioral deficiencies. Okay, so that's the core narrative, that there's something that black folks are doing wrong that contributes to the situation where black folks have so much less. Okay, and there's a number of behavioral deficiencies that are typically invoked. One of these is the argument that black folks save too little. It's the bling factor. Black folks overspend. A second is that black folks have some sort of resistance to obtaining education, that there's an oppositionality towards educational achievement. Third is black folks just don't work hard enough. Fourth is, well, the real problem is black folks are financially illiterate. So if we had financial literacy courses, we could close this enormous wealth gap. Fifth argument is that it's family structure, that black folks have too many single-parent families, and as a consequence, this affects the generation of wealth in those households. And then the final one I want to talk about today, and I'm going to talk about it in a little greater depth than the others, is the notion that the failure of the black community to acquire significant wealth is a consequence of the failure of black Americans to buy black or to bank black. Okay? I suspect you all have heard all of these in some shape or form, and I'm going to take them on one by one. Okay? So the first argument is the argument that black folks don't save adequately, and that's why we have this immense wealth differential. So the first thing I want to say is if the average black family were to close the wealth gap, it would require that family to save 100% of their income for 3 consecutive years. Okay, that's how vast the gap is. So that marginal changes in savings rates are really going to do very, very little to close a gap of that magnitude. Okay? But also I want to point out that once you take into account household income, there is actually not a racial difference in savings behavior. In fact, in some categories of income, blacks actually have a higher savings rate than whites. A study that was conducted by the Institute for Assets and Social Policy reported in 2017 that the average white household actually spends 1.3 times more on average than a black household with the same level of income. Okay, so that doesn't cut it. All right, so the second one is the education argument, that black folks don't pursue education with a sufficient passion. I've never really understood how this argument gained any kind of credibility. I mean, if you look at the historical record, the only avenue that black Americans have perceived for social mobility, apart from the occasional opportunity to become a highly paid athlete or entertainer, is through education. Okay. And if you look at the data on comparisons in the acquisition of years of schooling and credentials, you will find that for a given level of household income, young blacks obtain more years of schooling and more credentials than comparably situated young whites. Indeed, we also have found that another indicator of the black commitment to education is the following. Black parents who provide financial support for their children's higher education have 1/3 of the net worth of white parents who provide no support for their children's higher education. Okay? And then the final thing I want to point out here in the context of the wealth gap specifically is that blacks with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of whites who never finished high school. Okay, so let me repeat that. Blacks with a college degree have 2/3 of the wealth of whites who never finished high school. Now, I want to caution you. I am an enthusiast for education. Okay? I'd be a hypocrite otherwise. But I want to make it clear that additional educational attainment is not something that will come anywhere near sufficient to close the racial wealth gap. Okay, so let me come to the third one, the work effort argument. Well, I'm going to hit this one very quickly. Blacks who are working full-time have less wealth than whites who are unemployed. Okay? I come to improved financial literacy. So you can give people additional training about how to manage their resources, although I would argue that the folks with the least resources are the best managers. Okay. Folks who are more affluent don't have to worry about any kind of adverse decision that they make. Okay. And so I'm in favor of financial literacy training if you have some finances to manage. Okay. So that's the first step in the process, is the provision of resources that could then motivate having a financial literacy program. But if you have financial literacy programs without any finances to manage, you will not magically generate those finances. Okay. In addition, I'd like to point out that I don't think anybody has claimed that the folks who Bernie Madoff defrauded were financially illiterate. Okay. All right, so now let's come to the family structure one. And here's a very interesting statistic, which I think is the only one I want to use in this context, which is that the median white single parent has 2.2 times the wealth of the median black household that has two parents. Okay? The median white single parent household has 2.2 times the wealth of the median black household where there are two parents. And that's from the Survey of Consumer Finances from 2013. Okay, so let me come to the other one that I said I was going to talk about in a more elaborate fashion, which is this notion that if black folks would only buy from black businesses or black banks, that we would close the wealth gap. Okay, and this is similar to the claim that's made about the financial crisis for HBCUs, where you will frequently hear from various folks who are involved with those institutions that if their alumni would only give more, they could rectify the financial status of those institutions. But now you've heard the data that I've offered about the magnitude of the wealth disparity. And so if you really wanted to do something about improving alumni giving at HBCUs, you would have to improve the wealth position of those alumni. They actually do quite a lot with the more limited resources they have. And I think that what we ultimately play into is some notion of living your life in complete austerity. So as if people who have less resources should never have any fun and never use their resources for anything whatsoever that's frivolous, okay? And I think that's madness, okay? So, all right. So what about buying black and banking black? All right, so let me go back to 1968. And this is the year that Martin Luther King Jr. called for a bank in. And I'm going to argue, and I'm going to mention in a bit that I certainly don't think there's something wrong with buying black. Again, the big point is going to be it's not going to close the racial wealth gap. Okay, so Martin Luther King called for a bank in, and at the same time, presidential hopeful Richard Nixon came out campaigning on the idea of black capitalism. Okay, now a lot of people are actually surprised that Richard Nixon actually used that language. He was an advocate of black capitalism. And in his speech to the Republican National Convention, Nixon proclaimed, instead of government jobs and government housing and government welfare, let government use its tax and credit policies to enlist in this battle against poverty, the greatest engine of progress ever developed in the history of man, American private enterprise. Okay? So black capitalism in Nixon's eyes was the solution. While white America received ample government support through public policies to build and maintain wealth, and examples of this is what the historian Ira Katz-Nelson called affirmative action for whites. This includes the GI Bill, this includes the federal home loan mortgage opportunities and the like. While whites received those kinds of supports from public policies, blacks received a deficient private sector strategy from Nixon. Black capitalism was a solution that would allow the government to hand over the economic problems of poverty and insufficient wealth in the black community to the community itself, effectively ridding the government of responsibility. So black businesses and banks, however, cannot thrive on a separate and unequal playing field. For instance, in the US, black banks are smaller and less profitable than similar peer institutions. And this is not because these institutions lack a strong business model or viable leaders, but because of the economic situation of the communities where they operate. For instance, as blacks have minimal liquid wealth, their bank accounts tend to merely hold money for day-to-day and week-to-week expenses. Small and unstable deposits due to the continued economic penalties forced upon black workers and households makes profitability a significant challenge for banks that rely upon them as customers. In the end, if black banks and businesses are a supposed solution to the racial wealth gap, we have to address a basic mathematics problem that arises. To close the gap, black banks and enterprises must earn a much higher rate of return than white businesses. And without this, the gap will only be perpetuated rather than ended. Indeed, what is the state of black enterprise in the United States today? A recent report by the Association for Enterprise Opportunity suggests or indicates that while there are 2.58 million black-owned businesses in the U.S., which collectively generate $150 billion in revenue, and actually that's not that large, but we'll come back to that. Blacks nevertheless lack sufficient ownership over productive capacity. For instance, in 2016, the top 100 black-owned banks identified by Black Enterprise collectively grossed about $24 billion and employed 73,940 workers. In contrast, Walmart, the top firm by revenue in the United States, grossed more than 20 times as much revenue and employed over 2.2 million workers than the entire top 100 black-owned firms combined in 2016. So Walmart alone, okay? So if you were to double or triple or quadruple the revenues of these firms, they still would not be major players on the American economic landscape. Black-owned banks also are minuscule in the context of the general scale of American banking. The largest 5 banks were estimated to have assets totaling $2.3 billion, while J.P. Morgan alone had an estimated $2 trillion in assets. So the top 5 black banks' assets were a tiny 0.1% of Morgan's assets. So this indicates that the existing infrastructure of black-owned banks does not have the capacity to produce wide and substantial increases in black wealth. Moreover, since black wealth is so low in the first place, it is a mere fantasy to anticipate that the existing black consumer base could build a black-owned equivalent of J.P. Morgan by banking black. Okay. The key to assisting black businesses in their development and growth lies in leveling the racial wealth landscape and creating much, much greater access to capital in the first place. Prior research has confirmed that individuals with access to family wealth, both directly through transfers from immediate family members and indirectly through kin networks, have markedly higher rates of entrepreneurship and are more likely to start larger businesses. And I would add, those businesses are more likely to be sustainable. 2 decades ago, this is 2 decades ago, Timothy Bates found that individuals with relatively high levels of education and at least $100,000 in net worth were the persons most likely to undertake self-employment. I will note that, once again, that the median net worth for the average white household from the Survey of Consumer Finances is approximately $100,000. Okay. Now, some people may argue that the wealthy tend to make better entrepreneurs. Evans and Jovanovich argue strongly that the data reject this explanation and that the levels of capital required to start businesses systematically exclude non-wealthy individuals who otherwise might be very effective in entrepreneurial activity. So with the distribution and denial of black wealth, along with the continued exclusion of blacks from business credit markets, blacks simply do not have the capacity to acquire resources necessary to build corporations that could be major players in the global economy. Mirza Baradaran, who is a law professor at the University of Georgia, has forcefully argued that buying black, banking black is a stance that is symptomatic of an attraction to a fantastic dream of black capitalism. She contends that, again, in the absence of a wide, deep, and independent foundation in wealth among black Americans, the prospect of a world of giant black-owned corporations is no more than a chimera. Baradaran's central conclusion is capitalism, whether black or white, cannot fix problems created by racialized public policies. So, let me say, once again, I hardly object to banking black or buying black. I think that this is a wonderful idea in terms of norms of black solidarity. But the failure to bank black does not explain why we have a racial wealth gap, and banking black will not significantly reduce the racial wealth gap. Okay. Now, this leads me back to the story that I want to tell ultimately, which is why we have these enormous differences in racial wealth. And the core of this is the historical processes in this society which have determined which individuals or which households have the greater capacity to transfer resources to the next generations. Okay? So it's the intergenerational transmission of wealth that is the key consideration in this process. And that those transfers take 2 forms. One is an inheritance, where the donor has died and has passed the resources on to the next generation. The other is something that we economists called in vivo transfers, which is just a fancy name for gifts, which is transfers that occur while the donor is still living. Okay. And I think people underestimate the significance of these kinds of transfers because we frequently don't even think of them as being gifts. So, for example, if parents finance their kids' higher education, frequently folks say, well, that's what they're supposed to do. But that's an intergenerational transfer, and it's not a trivial one. If a young couple that's newly married gets support from their parents or grandparents for making the down payment on a new home, that's a gift. And so it's not just a question of the magnitude of the amounts of the gifts, but what's also crucial is the timing. And that timing cannot be exercised by families or households who don't have the foundation in a significant enough wealth. And so so that's the core of it, is the intergenerational transfers. And let me also emphasize, intergenerational transfers that are gifts or inheritances are not merit-based. Okay, they're not merit-based. I presume they're affectional, but they're definitely not merit-based. Okay. So that leads me to the final set of observations about where we are today. So the wealth gap really emerges in the crucible of the Jim Crow period, and the starting point is the failure to provide the formerly enslaved folks with the 40 acres and a mule that they were promised. That's where we begin the racial wealth gap. Okay, it's not so much in slavery itself, it is in the failure to initially compensate the ex-slaves for their enslaved status. Okay. During the course of the Jim Crow period, a number of events took place that essentially constituted wealth stripping, wealth that was stripped away from black Americans. And one of those sets of events was a wide array of white massacres that took place in a number of cities where there were prospering or prosperous black communities that were essentially destroyed. So they're classic examples. One of them is Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. Another that's very famous, perhaps the most famous, is the Tulsa Massacre of 1921. But there were hundreds of these. And it's very interesting that 1968 was the year, 50 years ago, when the Kerner Commission report was issued. And the Kerner Commission report was an analysis of black rage and black riots in urban black communities. Okay. There was never a commission introduced to evaluate or to examine the white riots that destroyed so many black lives and so much black property. Okay, and so it's an examination of that process of white terror that's critical to understanding the destruction of black wealth. The other thing that I'll mention here is that in the aftermath of the failure to provide the ex-slaves with their 40 acres and a mule, which would have amounted to at least 40 million acres of land, somehow, the newly emancipated black community managed to accumulate, by the beginning of the 20th century, approximately 15 million acres of land at their own behest. Okay. I mean, this is almost a miraculous story in some ways. But progressively, that 15 million acres of land was taken away. It was seized. It was appropriated. Deeds that individuals had on their land were destroyed in mysterious fires in courthouses. And so as a consequence, when we get to the latter half of the 20th century, black American land ownership is down to the vicinity of about 1 million acres of land. Now, one of the things that we've tended to do is we've tended to associate land ownership with farming. And I want to disabuse you of the notion that land is only important because of farming. One illustration is if you look at the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, that land is not used for farming, but it's extraordinarily valuable now, and it used to be land that was in the possession of black folks. Okay. Island of Manhattan. Square foot of land on the island of Manhattan. It's worth about $5,000. That's a square foot. Okay. There's not much farming that's taking place on Manhattan Island. All right. So I just want to reemphasize, and this is my closing observation, that land possession is extremely significant in terms of the maintenance and preservation of wealth. And it is very interesting that the very first thing that the formerly enslaved folks said they wanted was land. And it's also what they were denied. need to come up?
Kirsten to come forward. And we have a mic that's going around if you have a question so we can hear you.
First of all, let me thank you both again for coming, and this was wonderful, and I'm so proud to be a part of this intellectual community, to have such wonderful speakers here. My question, and just having some familiarity with some of your work, Dr. Darity, maybe you, both of you could speak to some of the kinds of policy prescriptions that you have proffered to move us closer to this place.
You want to start? Oh, you want me to start?
Yes, sir.
All right. Okay. I think Kirsten wants me to start because I've actually written some stuff about this, not out of deference. Okay. So I've talked about two sorts of policies, but obviously one of the policies is reparations for African Americans, which would be a direct route towards trying to address these huge disparities that we have in mind. So one of the key objectives of a reparations program from our perspective is closing the racial wealth gap. Okay, so that's one approach. And I actually think that, well, I always argue that even if you perceive something as very difficult to do politically, if it's the right thing to do, then you need to try to build your movement to do it. So, you know, when apartheid was in full force in South Africa, circa 1956 or 57, it probably looked, people would have a very high degree of pessimism about opposing it and dismantling that structure, but it didn't prevent some people from resisting that structure, and it laid the foundation for what occurred much, much later. So I don't necessarily expect to see reparations in my lifetime, but it's got to happen, and so we need to build a movement to have it take place. So that's the first policy. Now, reparations obviously is what we refer to as a race-specific policy because it's intended to address an array of injustices that were specifically imposed upon Black Americans. But we could accomplish some measure of redistributive equity with a policy that is universal, but not race-specific, but race-conscious. And when I say a policy is race-conscious but not race-specific, I mean that it's a policy that will disproportionately benefit a targeted segment of the community, even though the policy goes to everyone in the community. So this particular idea is one that's been developed by Derek Hamilton at the New School and myself, which is what we call the baby bonds proposal. And it's not really a bond. It's actually a trust fund that would be publicly funded for all newborn infants. So the idea here is rich folks give their kids trust funds. Why shouldn't every child have a trust fund? And this trust fund would be, the amounts of this trust fund would be contingent upon the wealth position of the child's family. So for the very wealthiest, for children born into the very wealthiest families, like Bill Gates' family, for example, we give them a $50 trust fund. But for children born into families at the lowest end of the wealth distribution, we'd give them a $50,000 to $60,000 trust fund. And if the average amount of the trust fund was $25,000, there are about 4 million infants that are typically born in a given year in the United States. So the program's annual cost would be about $100 billion, which I think is in the vicinity of 2% of the national budget. So it's not onerously expensive. And so what could then be done is to set an older age at which the child could have access to the funds, whether it's 18 or 21. And so you would have, with the very first cohort, 18 years before funds would need to be paid out. So you could begin to build a public endowment to support the program. And so we'd also want to guarantee the trust fund recipients a 1% real rate of interest, which is 1% above the rate of inflation for each year until they're able to access the fund. So why is this race conscious? Because black folks have so little wealth that young people born into black families would disproportionately benefit from a program like this. Yeah. There's a question over there.
Thank you very much for what you've given us this evening. I have two very quick questions. The first is, when will your book be available? The second is, what form do you think reparations should take?
So we have just received reviewers' comments on the book, and I can say, and we're responding to them now. Like the first set were like glowing, very exciting, and the second sets were like glowing, and love this section, need more of this. Love that section, need more of this. So we're in the process of, owning what we can from both reviewers, and but also holding our own. But hopefully, in the next 2 months, we will have finished that process. So if everything goes right, I would like to think that this time next year the book would be out. Okay. So I think we'll both talk about some of the forms that reparations might take. Sandy mentioned the possibility of some kind of fund that might pay for a college education, for example. There might also be a fund that was available to communities where the community might elect a group of wise people who would receive business proposals, possibly. But we also think it's really important to cut a check. To cut a check. Yep. Because there are a number of people who have worked on this question of how much money are we talking about, and how do you determine how much money should be in that pool. But we start with the value of 40 acres and a mule, right? What was it worth at the time, and what is it worth now? So what did we decide? How many acres did we calculate are in an acre? Some of you may know this off the top of your heads. I do not.
You mean how many?
No, sorry. How many? What was we thinking about? We're trying to think of 40 acres, and so how many? Like if you were dividing that into housing.
Oh, square miles.
Square miles, right? Thank you. So if you were dividing, if you were looking at, this gets back to Sandy's his question about what you could do with the land.
So I think the typical house in America is on 0.2 acres of land.
So just think about developing your 40 acres. What you could do with that.
A residential community.
Right.
Yeah. How many units could you put on a residential community of 40 acres? And then, but what's interesting is how staggering the size is of the largest plantations.
Right.
So what's the Stagville plantation?
47 square miles.
Yeah.
2 counties.
Yeah. Yeah.
1,000 black bodies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huge. Yes.
So it's like 2,000 acres or something. I mean, yeah, it's staggering.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Sorry. So I wonder if you could speak directly to the attempt at reparations that Georgetown University did. Because I hear a lot of people talking about, free education. And I wonder, because my own thought is that that's not sufficient.
You want me to?
And that it assumes something about education that I don't think is always necessarily a good assumption.
So one thing I want to say about the Georgetown offer, to the best of my understanding, they did not offer free education. They offered preferential treatment in admissions. No money.
A little more affirmative action.
Yes. Now, I actually did the numbers. I don't have them in front of me. Starting with, 272 enslaved people, is that right? If they actually gave free education to all of those descendants, that would be significant. But we feel that these are sort of piecemeal efforts, and everyone's not going to benefit from that. What would be more, what would be a better way, I think, or maybe I shouldn't say better, but what we would really like to see colleges and universities do is to take the lead and talk about the need for reparations for African Americans. Institutions of higher learning are largely responsible for the whole conversation, I want to say this, a scholarship that supports all of these notions of black people being cognitively inferior. There's such a connection, a strong connection between especially the Ivy colleges and slavery. Every single one of them. I mean, there are no exceptions. Either they were fundraising on the plantations, they were sending the young men to be the, what was the word? What is the word for the person who would, your tutors on these plantations. Those young kids would then go, it's a circle, they would come to the universities. They have tremendous culpability in this process. And it would be terrific to see them not just study themselves, not just erect another monument to slavery on their campuses. Sandy gave a talk at the University of Virginia. Dr. Donaldson was there as well. Yeah. And so the conference was focusing on university slavery, the memory, and the built environment. And there was a moment, I wish I had it on film, when they were talking, this huge, this tent, outsized tent on the Commons, and they were talking with great pride about this monument, this public art project that they had commissioned, and an artist was hired to create an arc on the Commons that was exactly the same dimensions as the rotunda that Jefferson had designed, which was we're supposed to feel real good about that, but at any rate, and inscribed on the inside were to be the names of all the enslaved Africans that they could determine had some connection to the actual construction of the campus. So Say and I were both watching this phalanx of black employees in black and white uniforms, standing, at the side, listening. It's like, really? Is that all you got? Is that all you got? I mean, no one was saying, how about increasing their salary tenfold? No one was talking about inviting their children to go to school. I mean, it was just, the irony was just startling. And the R word, we kept on the R word, no one would mention reparations in these sessions we were in. It's like, excuse me, aren't we supposed to be talking about reparations? What is this? It's like, how far back can we get, how far back can we pull our chairs from this table so that we don't have to talk about reparations?
Yeah. So I like the word that Kirsten used about piecemeal reparations, so that they're individual institutions that feel some measure of guilt, and so they separately or independently will try to do something. And this also applies to individuals. I mean, essentially that's the DeWolf family's strategy, is to say, well, what can we do individually to try to address or atone for our family's history? And what we have continuously said is what you really can do is become an advocate for reparations for all black Americans. That's what you really should be doing. That this piecemeal, well, the other term we use, and I don't want to see anybody else using this because it's going to be in our book. Laissez-faire reparations is what I call it. And we think that there is a national obligation and a national responsibility, and it requires a public movement to accomplish that. And so folks who feel individual guilt about what has happened historically, I think they should salve that guilt not by purchasing additional scholarships or anything like that, but putting their political capital behind the provision of reparations for all black Americans.
Yes. Good evening. Just as a factual point, my hometown, Washington, D.C. is 10 square miles. So I don't know how many people can get in 40 acres. Maybe we need 80 acres in a mule, 2 mules. Yeah.
Well, actually, there was a piece of legislation that provided 80 acres.
Right.
And we actually do a calculation in our book based upon the 80-acre figure also.
And so as folklore, so in life you got 2 mules, 8 acres, 2 mules, one named Stormy, one named Blue. So which mule are you plowing today, Stormy or Blue? Okay, the other point is I'm sort of simple-minded, so I went on Dr. Google on my cell phone and I typed in the word reparations. reality is we have these events in the Ivory Tower. Thank you, Dr. Donaldson. But we in the vineyard, I would like to see whether or not you're getting some feedback from just the regular people on the street about this issue.
Well,
and then the other point,
so I'm not sure what regular people are, but
Yeah.
well, you know,
I feel kind of regular myself.
yeah, no, I mean,
but we
I'm a
have.
Wait, hold on. I'm a member of this community, and I probably know everybody in there in one fashion or the other. But the homeless guy that I seen on the street the other day, I don't ever see him at none of these meetings.
Did you invite him?
Well, I couldn't find him. He's homeless.
Well.
You know, we
So-
don't. Well, hold on. My point though is this: I thought that the definition of reparations was when a victorious nation asked for the country that they just defeated, like Germany and France, for you to pay me back for you doing wrong, and I defeated you. So,
Yeah.
I mean,
And so
when are we away? We as African Americans got to have victory.
The Union never extracted reparations from the Confederacy. Okay, and that is what should have occurred, and that would have been the basis for the provision of these resources to the former slaves. So we could have taken over. We could have taken over despite the fact that we were completely excluded from the political process for so many years. Or how would you propose? Would we have taken over by armed conflict?
You know, what I see happening is that Obamacare work, whatever the reparations will be, might be tied to the IRS some kind of way. The IRS got to.
I don't see that.
Well, the IRS gets told what to do by the Congress. Yeah, I mean, come on. I'm not really sure what the point is there.
Thank you, Mr. Moses. Dr. Swinton. It's okay. We'll get right to you.
Ready?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, so this gentleman.
I'm sorry.
The gentleman back here.
I'm sorry.
First,
sorry.
then
and then
Dr.
Dr. Swinton.
How far would it go if all in vivo transfers of wealth to family members were taxable as unearned income and that bequests were limited to 50% of the donor's wealth and the rest going back to the public sector for the benefit of all to close the wealth gap that you've been talking about?
So the real question is, if you were to use the taxation strategy for existing estates in some form, whether it's a tax that's administered after an individual has died, or whether it's a tax that's administered on their current possessions, the real question is, what do you do with the money that you have taxed away? And so I think the only way you could really be sure that you were going to have an effect by doing that on the kinds of disparities that we're describing is if you, in fact, executed a program that would redistribute those funds, and that would require something like a reparations program or a baby bonds program. So, you know, regardless of whether or not you financed reparations or a baby bonds program by the use of that taxation procedure that you're describing, you would have to have those types of programs in place to be effective in terms of trying to change the terrain of racial wealth inequality. Yeah.
Sorry, Dr.
Swinton was next. Yeah.
How you guys doing?
Okay.
wonderful to
How are
see
you?
I haven't seen you in quite a while.
We just saw Maury last week.
Oh, good. They kind of mentored my son when he was up there at Duke. I've known these folks ever since they were in graduate school and watched their careers blossom. Both been very successful. I'm proud of you guys. I think I had something to do with it. But in any case, I had a couple of thoughts. One, that when you look at the history of this country and the history of race relations in this country, wealth and equalizing wealth is a major part of reparations. But I really think there's a lot of non-wealth aspects to the damage that was done to that community. And I think, if you think about capital real broadly, and then not only you have financial capital, human capital, you got psychological capital, you got motivational capital. I mean, you got all kinds of capital deficits that exist in that community. Now, I would grant it that just doing the financial reparations would go a long ways to moving that out, but still, there should be some attention paid to these other aspects of the inequities that's been imposed on this group. And we've been talking about this for years, and I believe that you're on the right track. I don't go to the 40 acres and a mule thing. I don't know if you ever remember the paper I wrote, but I'm saying that the current impact on the current living generation of African Americans is completely summed up in all of these capital disparities. Yeah. And you really don't have to do any long-range calculation. You just have to look at the current existing differences, et cetera. As far as staying in the South, my family is from South Carolina, and we eventually made our way to New York, and I made my way back again. But from the end of the 19th century to about 1970 in the 20th century, African Americans was actually chased out of the South by all kinds of strategies. African Americans in South Carolina, for example, outnumbered whites in South Carolina at the turn of the century 2-1. By 1970, it had completely flipped, reversed. And it was the terrorism, the lack of opportunities, the exploitation, et cetera. I think it's a very complex subject. I can understand the last set of questions because it really gets to how do you get people to do this? And I think you taking the initiative to try to tell people that there should be a public movement and encouraging people to get behind. That's the only way it's going to happen. Yeah. And so I appreciate you guys still being in this battle, and I appreciate what you're doing, and looking forward to reading your book.
Thank you. I actually have a story I want to tell. David mentioned a paper that he had written years ago, and I think it's the paper that was published in Dick America's volume, The Wealth of Races. Yeah. Is that? Yeah. So here's the story. This is about late 1980s. There's a scholar who was based at the University of Pennsylvania named Richard F. America. Yeah, and that's really his name. Okay. And he approached me about writing an introduction to a volume that he was editing on reparations. And at the time I said, well, that's never going to happen. And Dick said to me, read the papers and write whatever you want in the way of an introduction. And so one of the papers was David Swinton's paper. And it was reading that set of papers that led me to say, all right, this is going to be hard to do, but it's the right thing to do. So thank you for that. Yeah.
You should also,
yeah.
I was going to say, you should also tell the story, and I'm not going to have the whole thing here, but in introducing the volume, Richard America tells the story about his own four greats grandfather.
It may
3
be,
or 4. Maybe
it
further
may,
back.
it may be his great-grandfather.
His great-grandfather.
Yeah.
Who was a highly valued enslaved person, and he was a runaway. And they found notices in the paper.
And his name, his
And
last name was
he was
America.
also America.
His
He's
last
also
name was
a Dick America.
Yeah, yeah.
Dick America. And the ad in the paper said, the ad in the paper described him. It described his complexion and his height and his cunning. Be the very intelligent Negro. So it's like a trickster. Be very, don't take him for granted. But then the other thing was he had 2 cash amounts that he offered, dead and alive, and he offered more for him if he was brought back dead. Very unusual. He wanted that Negro any way he could get him, but dead was fine. Yes.
Hi, my name is Danica. I'm a sophomore here at USC, and just as you guys were talking, I couldn't help but think about, how Black Americans, specifically Black men, are disproportionately represented in our correctional facilities here. So I definitely think, along with, I'm sure everybody else, that there's a relationship between the wealth disparities that you guys talked about and that disproportionate representation. So just wondering to see how you guys would comment on that intersection.
So there's actually a paper that a team of us did that appeared in Race and Social Problems, I guess about a year ago. And it's actually on the relationship between incarceration and wealth. And one of the things that we find is blacks who had relatively higher levels of wealth, and of course that's within a smaller band than the band for whites, but blacks with relatively higher levels of wealth were more likely to be incarcerated than whites with lower levels of wealth. And so this is probably an arena that is not resolved by changing the racial wealth distribution. This is an arena that has to be addressed by confronting the practices of the criminal justice system and the police. And that still will be an issue, regardless of the introduction of a reparations program, although those types of injustices are another rationale for a reparations program.
This has just been a great conversation and dialogue. I do have a couple of questions and comments. You mentioned earlier about the transference of wealth. And I guess my question is, regarding reparations and transference of wealth, awesome comment, awesome thought process. But I guess my skepticism and my concern in that is that what we have seen over the time is when people transfer, particularly African Americans, a lot of times transfer wealth, property, or whatever it is to their children and their descendants down the line. For some strange reason, proportionally, these things get lost. They get lost, they get sold, policy coming in place, they get taken away from them. I mean, all kind of things. We own my great-grandparents' land in the country, and not having understanding and clarity of it, the law and the regulations of it, you talk about the property. We can't do anything with the property because it's air property. And there's too many people involved in it. So the law and the rule is, the transference of it is that you have to let it go and bid up for taxes. Somebody has to be in a place or position to get it, because if you don't, you lose it. The conversation and the dialogue, my concern with that is that when we get the wealth, or when we get the reparations, our people being in a place and a position to understand and know what it is that you're getting, how you keep it, and how you maintain it. You made a good point. Give them a check. Okay, you give them a check. And I'm not saying this in a negative way. I'm saying it from, the gentleman made a point about our young people and how our people are, today. You get a check. The first thing you do, you go to the mall. You go and buy clothes. You go and buy a car. You buy the bling. And those things are not a part of the sustainability of you as a people or as a community. So my concern is that when you get the reparations, as my grandmama said, then what? When you get it, then what? So I'm hearing the conversation about we need it and we're going to get it and this is great, but then when you get it, then what?
So I think we both are going to have things to say about this. So one response that I have immediately is, well, if you want to go to the mall with your check, why not?
Go right ahead.
It's your money, right? So
you're going to be better off than you were before you had it.
Right. You know, if you need some yoga, if you need a massage, if you need some makeup to make you feel better and do your job, you can afford it. No one said to the Japanese Americans when they received reparations, oh, let's put strings attached. They're not fill in the blank, wise enough, thoughtful enough, intelligent enough to know how to spend this money. Why are we the people who everyone wants to say, ooh, look out, look out, look out, look out. Crazy black people, they don't have good sense. Really? You know, that's my first thought. You know, yes, I think it's important for us to figure out all these laws. I mean, there's a reason why the laws are so labyrinthine and complicated, right? They don't want you to have that land, right? I mean, there are entire professions that have arisen to help solve these quote-unquote problems. You know, put some of your people through law school. You know, use that money to educate members of your own family and raise them to have integrity so that they can consult and help everyone else in the family. And we used to always say, we need a lawyer, we need a doctor, we need a couple of doctors. You know, we need a chef. You know, create what you need. You know, take some agency. I'm not saying these things are not important. They are important. They're essential. But think again about why you think we can't handle our own business. There are going to be people on every corner trying to help us figure out how to spend this money once it happens. You can bet. You can bet your life on that. So it is important to be ready, to be thinking about it. I mean, with 9/11, horrible thing had happened, but reparations were paid to the families who lost loved ones. No one said, here are the conditions under which they will receive those funds. No one. It wasn't even part of the conversation. Why should it be part of our conversation? Now, we also feel that it's important that a significant amount of money be set aside for education. But we weren't thinking about it in the sense that you're talking about. We want the American people to understand why this is important. And it needs to happen for several generations because people forget. People forget. I mean, the history that we have delved into was news to me, much of it. I can't tell you how many times I would open a book and go, wow, why don't I know this? You know, why wasn't I taught this? You know, this happened down the street, you know, from my family. Why don't I know this story? You know, we have to retell these stories often so that they take, right? And that's not going to happen with 4 or 5 PSAs. You know, it needs to be taught in the schools. There need to be posters. There need to be billboards. There need to be books. There need to be movies. You know, who will be our Ava DuVernay? Who will be our what's his name? Singleton.
Yeah.
John Singleton. John Singleton. Who will be the people who will tell this story and put flesh on the bones?
So I want to give a response that I think is more consistent with what may be bothering you, which is I think there will need to be something that this rhymes, but we like to call pre-reparations preparation. Okay, and so I think there will be a need to have some serious conversations about what folks will do with the resources, but ultimately, from the portion of the reparations that takes the form of a direct payment to the recipient community, individuals should be able to use it as they see fit. Now, I've talked in one of the papers that I've written about something that I've called a portfolio of reparations, which is to say that the total reparations package could take multiple forms. So it could include the provision of some sort of financial asset that there might be some restrictions on your capacity to transfer it before some period of time. I mean, I think we can be creative, but I do think there needs to be some sum of money that goes to individuals that they can use as they see fit.
Well, we realize that this would lead to many conversations. That's why we have a reception planned for you. Please join me in thanking Kirsten and Sandy for an extraordinary presentation. Thank you. I especially would like to thank my colleague, Dr. Daniela Cook. We should go to lunch more often, Professor Cook. This has come to pass. So thank you. I also want to thank all of our campus partners, and particularly the number of students who worked on this project over the last several weeks. You know who you are. Jill Found, Patrice Green, Andrea Wardlaw, Jonathan Johnson, Celeste Minor, Brewington Bryant, Karen Strickland, many others, and especially this great audience. Thank you for being here tonight. Please join us for this reception for the next half an hour. Thank you.